Welcome to the sixth session of our Clergy Roundtable for the Lenten season. We've been discussing the book Deep Rooted in Christ, The Way of Transformation by Joshua Chunman Kang. It has been the inspiration for our Lenten season with the theme Rooted. I want to first introduce my colleagues and friends, Reverend Dr. Dawson Taylor, who's the senior minister here at Naples United Church of Christ, and Dr. Sharon Harris-Ewing, who is the assistant minister here. Have you ever felt like that's a mouthful to say?
Yes.
Every time.
Every time.
I trip over myself.
Every time, yes.
But we couldn't do this without our fabulous production team. Tonight it is Nick and Hunter who are helping us along, because if we had to do it ourselves, I'm not so sure how well we would do. And also a special thank you to Wendy Gayer, who sets the stage for us and makes it beautiful with flowers and makes sure everything is in order for us to do this. So before we get started, I want to ask Dawson if he has any announcements for us.
You know, I was just thinking, we were talking before we went live that this Sunday is Palm Sunday.
I know.
And so we start the Holy Week journey, which, just kind of boggles my mind. I always think when Ash Wednesday starts, Easter is so far away. And then I blink and here we are. So, just reminders that we'll have our midweek Lenten service. And Sharon, I believe you're preaching that, and then we will have a Monday, Thursday service at 7 and a Good Friday service at noon, and then of course Easter at the Phil at 9 and 11. So I mean, it's an exciting but hectic. I was trying to find a better word, but hectic week ahead. But I think it's such a holy week too. I mean, it really, really is,
and it's especially important this year, as we weren't able to be together in person last year, and so
and we were just
we're really looking forward to that.
Yeah, we were reinventing the wheel as we went. At least we have a better sense of things this year, or at least we think we do. And we were talking about our production team, and I just want to say words of gratitude to Brad Van Houten, our director of production, because he's kind of the wizard behind the curtain who just makes a lot of things happen very quietly and unassumingly. And so he's not here because he's created a wonderful team that makes things happen. And so I just want to say words of gratitude to Brad.
And we are grateful. Yeah. We are. So tonight we're working on part 7, and the title of it is Righteousness Has a Heart, which was an interesting concept for me. And so let me start talking a little bit about it. We spent a lot of time on understanding the countless ways God is at work in the transformation process in all of our lives. The title is Righteousness Has a Heart. So I want to start with the word righteous. For me, it has some baggage. I'm not sure if it does for you. It's a word that has different connotations in the English language than it had in the original languages in the Hebrew and Greek scriptures. So I'm going to start with the definition of the word righteous that comes from Merriam-Webster. And according to that dictionary, righteous means acting in accord with divine or moral law, free from guilt or sin, morally right or justifiable, arising from an outraged sense of justice. So, I think I know where my hesitation comes from. It's from that last part of it, the righteous, indignation kind of thing. But as I was going back and looking at the Greek and the Hebrew, they have elements of that definition, but it goes far beyond our English definition, what we think about when we hear the word. There's a complexity to that word in the scriptures, and I think the more helpful definition for it has to do with relationship. In particular, a right relationship with God and with others. To be righteous in scripture is to reflect God's character in all of our relationships. So with that in mind, I really do begin to understand Kang's chapter heading a little better, that righteousness has a heart. It begins with a loving relationship with God, who is in the transformation business. So when you heard the word righteous, what thoughts came to your mind. Wanna start?
Well, I, like you, think of it, I guess this is just what I learned some long time ago in terms of right relationship. And that relationship with God and with God's people and with one another. What's interesting to me is that the passage that came to my mind is from Amos 5 about let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. And the parallelism there suggests that there's a sense in which righteousness is also related to justice, which for me makes sense because it's both about right relationships, living in love for one another and love for God. And when I was thinking about that, I was thinking, I really love the idea of justice has a heart.
Oh.
So I just played with it. But in terms of, for me, the negative connotation comes with self-righteous.
Absolutely.
That I think I'm right and you're wrong. That's a whole different thing than righteousness as a biblical and theological concept.
And I do think that's really important because I think the stumbling block seems to be in how the English definition has evolved for us. Yeah. How
Yeah,
about you?
and I was really, frankly, relieved to hear that it had baggage for you. I mean, I'm sorry for your baggage, but at the same time, I was just so grateful to know that I'm not the only one, because I thought, oh, this is going to sound really good, that one of the pastors thinks righteousness is a really loaded term, but it feels that way. So I'm grateful to know that both of you have that as well. And when I was reviewing the notes and I saw your definition, or the Merriam-Webster definition that talks about morally right, I could feel like almost a physical reaction to morally right, because I think about the moral right in religious political circles, and I think about people who talk about being morally right. But I also think, Sharon, you hit on something that's really important: is righteousness alone does not have heart. It has to be coupled with justice. It has to be coupled with grace. It has to be coupled with something, in my opinion, for it to have heart. And I don't think King, again, unpacks that much, if at all, going back on my memory there. But I just feel like righteousness alone doesn't do that.
Yeah.
And so for me, I too had this like, oh, here we go, a chapter on righteousness, and so yeah, that was kind of, so I'm just relieved to know I'm in good company, I believe, so.
Good. So we're going to move on to chapter 38, and it's entitled A Vessel for the Power of God. And while we're discussing definitions, Kang uses the word purity in describing our lives as vessels for God to use. Now, lest you think we disagree with the entire book, we don't, but there are moments when he really talks about things that we kind of bristle at because of how it gets perceived in our culture.
Well, like I think in images, and so I'm thinking about like a very smooth flight that has a rough landing because of any number of circumstances. That's kind of how this book feels to me. It's been relatively smooth, a few bumps along the way, and then it feels like we have a little bit of a rough landing.
Yeah. And so if you are reading this book and you're wondering about it, you're in good company. There are a lot of good parts of it that I think have been really helpful and personally challenging.
Yeah, and create good conversation and things to think about.
But it's okay.
Yeah.
We're all there.
It will be okay.
It will be. So that word purity, I don't know about you, but that word has been often used in the Christian circles that I'm familiar with, in youth groups to encourage chastity. Some of you may remember that campaign, True Love Waits. In fact, the only time I feel like I have heard that word purity has always been associated with sexual purity, specifically refraining from sexual relationships outside of marriage. And I'm going to be really honest, it's almost always was directed specifically at women. Perhaps not. I mean, well, that you may have a different perspective on that, but that's the way it's been for me. So it's really loaded with baggage. Um, so, any comments on that before I move on to the next part?
Yeah, I mean, it's really loaded. Again, I don't think it's solely the South, but the South seems to really lift that up. And there are entire weekends of true love waits and wearing all white. And this is a documentary, I've never seen it in person, but where young women wear almost wedding dresses and give vows to future spouses and committing to purity and things like that. I agree that it's mostly aimed at, put upon women. What's interesting is that we're living in a time right now, for instance, the denomination of my birth, baptism, and confirmation, the United Methodist Church, has a rule that is literally tearing the denomination apart that talks about in ordination vows that anyone who is openly gay should refrain from sexual intimacy, even within the definition of a monogamous relationship or with now marriage equality. And so there are some who say in the denomination, okay, well, we can have gay clergy, but they have to be celibate, almost a Catholic view. And it's this idea of purity. Like, I don't agree with homosexuality, but as long as those people are not having sex, it'll be okay because it's, it remains pure. Again, what does pure mean? What does, so it's an interesting time that even in 2021, we're still having these, in my opinion, very strange conversations in the church around sexual intimacy, purity, and what those look like. But I agree, I think it's put upon women by far.
It's interesting. Without having heard from you, that connotation didn't come to me. But the problem I had with purity was that it connoted perfection. Mm-hmm. And that we're a vessel for the power of God, that we're supposed to be pure and perfect. And I'm reminded of Paul's talking about earthen vessels. Mm-hmm. And I think, if I got to be perfect, I might as well forget it because it's not going to happen.
I'm out before it ever starts.
So that's the trouble I had with it. I would agree with you in terms of the dynamics around sexuality, but for me it was just about, I'll never be perfect.
Well, and I think you get, throughout this entire section, I got that sense about perfectionism that was permeating it, that we'll talk about more too.
Yeah, and I appreciate you both raising that, because I really jumped into the intimacy kind of thinking around purity. I think that's kind of where my antennae went up. But I totally agree with what you're saying and what you're reflecting. There is this perfectionism, and again, I think about the cultural perspective that King brings to this, and so I think that might have been something that I didn't really pay close attention to.
And I think that might be part of my reaction in this section, is that, for us, we work so hard at being authentic and real and trying to be honest about things that are just human.
Right.
And I get the sense that there's not a lot of room for that in the book, and that may be just my interpretation, but we'll keep talking.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's more to it as we go. So as I read the chapter, though, I think King had a different idea in mind when he spoke about purity. He quoted the second letter to Timothy: "All who cleanse themselves of the things I've mentioned will become special utensils, dedicated and useful to the owner of the house, ready for every good work." So I think he focused part on the second half of that. He wrote, "What God expects a servant to be is pure, clean, cool instrument, not necessarily a sledgehammer, but a sanitized, sterilized, efficient instrument." What did you make of those words? I'm just laughing. A sledgehammer. I guess I've been that.
I'm just thinking of like the Hallmark section that says,
I know.
what a wonderful, sanitized, sterilized, efficient instrument of God you are to me. I mean, like the next Pastor Appreciation Month or something,
Yeah.
if someone gives me a card like that, I'm going to not know what to mean.
Well,
what
and
they
to
mean
think
by
this
that.
was written before the pandemic,
Well, that's the other thing is,
before we thought about sterilization,
I know.
sanitation of everything.
of everything. Yeah.
But for me, it was the sledgehammer
Yeah.
image. That was really helpful because I think sometimes, just like everybody else, we can be sledgehammered.
Well, I was going to say, should we go around the room and name sledgehammers that we think about when this image comes up? I mean, yeah, because, I call it whack-a-mole, where there are people who just seem like every time there's something that comes up, they have to whack it, they have to hit on it, hit it. And nothing about that is life-giving in a church. Pastors, laity alike, and so I think we all have our moments, but I do think there is this idea. Again, I too, Sharon, was caught by now we talk about everything being sanitized, but this idea of a cool instrument. I liked that idea.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Share anything on that?
No, not more than I've said.
So I'll move on. So Kang asks and answers the question, what kind of person does God work through? And he said, not a person who boasts about his or her competence. Instead, God looks for someone who maintains power inwardly, which I thought was actually very thoughtful. What kind of person do you think God works through most effectively? And maybe a second question is, what qualities help us to be open to God at work in and through us?
Well, and you just said what makes us open. I guess I'm not sure I can answer that question, but what I would say is the kind of person who's open. that God needs people who are open to listening, to being guided, to being filled, as he talks about with the Spirit, just open hearts and open minds, so that we can see even when God might be saying something unexpected. And the other thing about not boasting, I do think, and now that we're almost finished with the book, you really do see the recurring themes, and one of them that I really appreciate is humility. And the sense that, no, we're not going to boast. We're humble servants trying our best.
Yeah, I do appreciate that. You get that feeling from him. And even in the preface and the afterword, the people who wrote this book and edited it kept talking about that it was his character that they appreciated the most. And it made me really want to actually meet him, because I have a feeling he's very powerful in a very quiet way. So.
Yeah, I was thinking he must be a very charismatic leader, but perhaps in ways that would surprise us.
I think so too.
Yeah, I think about, I think it's always, I think it can be dangerous territory to say, though, who God will and won't work through. Because, I've watched God work through some really surprising people in my life. And I am pretty confident that somewhere in the world, people are saying, I never really thought God could work through Dawson, but, and he really did that one time. Or, I just think there's, I think it's always dangerous territory to think about for us to say who God can and cannot work through. But I think, at least, we've talked about it, but in our world, I think God, for me, works best through authentic people. I mean, to me, that is just such a touchstone for how open I am to receiving what it is that someone has to offer. Because if I feel that they are being inauthentic, I just shut down. And I've seen that happen so many times in churches with colleagues or other pastors, or if people feel a level of inauthenticity, it doesn't work. So I think God works, in my opinion, God works best through authentic people, but I believe that God can work through anyone.
Yeah, exactly.
And I really appreciate that, because if you think about some of the biblical story and reflections, God works through some pretty awful people.
Yeah.
And an affirmation, the people who are destroying you right now, that's God working
Right.
to teach you a lesson. And I don't want to be literalistic about that, but I do think that's a really important reminder. And you can almost ask two questions. How do I need to be in order to allow God to work through me? And when it comes to God working through other people, we can't judge.
Yeah.
I think that's the lesson for me, is that we can look at our own character about how we want to be available to God, but when we start judging, we lose it. And that's a really important point.
Yeah, I mean, never tell families to look at the Bible for healthy models of family functioning. I mean, there's far more examples of dysfunctional families in the Bible than not. And so, but again, in the story in its fullness, we do see God at work. And so again, it's not our place to judge. It's not our place to try to fix it, but to allow God to do what God does best.
Absolutely.
One of the best sermons I have ever heard in my life was by my Old Testament professor, who talked about many of the leading characters of particularly the Torah, the beginning of the Bible, but throughout the Hebrew Bible. And he said, just look at all these things they did. And his message was, that should give you great comfort, that if God can work through people who've done all these terrible things, I mean, with slaves and adultery and just all kinds of things, God can work through us.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is comforting. Okay, so let's go on to chapter 39, which the title is Deeper Spirituality in Pain. Kang says that God sets a great value on those who endure great trials. God purifies God's servants through suffering and readies them for ministries. God does choose the intelligent and noble from time to time, but God prefers those who are neglected by the world. After God makes the choice, God molds each person through suffering into deeper spiritual formation. Now, that sounds a little bit to me like God is the one causing the suffering. And we've had that conversation many times. What did you think of his take on this?
So I had two thoughts about this. The first was, it further confirmed my belief and view that God always sides with the marginalized. God is always on the side of those who are pushed out, down, and to the side. Again, not the theology that God caused or created that situation, but that God has deep grief that is happening and that's occurring, and that God is weeping in the midst of that. And so it just reiterated for me that God is always on the side of the marginalized. And then it also said to me, or this type of theology and thinking, that how easy it is for us to blame suffering on God and to wallow in that, but that I don't believe God creates or causes suffering. I believe the world, I believe humanity in of itself, we cause the suffering that we experience. And so I believe God weeps with us and celebrates with us. But I think theology that implies this gets really dangerous really fast.
I'm not sure he's actually doing that, because we're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
But I want to hear
Well,
what you have to say.
I want to give you a lot of credit, Deb, because as we have talked about this issue over weeks, and not only in this book, because it comes up in
Sure.
life and in many books, but you have been very helpful to me in making what is really a very fine distinction. And that is between, all of us would agree, God doesn't cause this. God doesn't will it. God doesn't want terrible things to happen to people. But, at least not the God I worship. But what you've always said is that they can be opportunities for growth.
Yeah.
And the fine distinction is, I've always said God can use those, they can lead to growth. But I think you just have taken it a step further, and that's been helpful for me to say, to really see it actively, how can I help this to become an opportunity for growth, and what might God be helping me to learn through this, which is still not that God wanted it, but God is with me, and if I can open myself up to hear from God, how can I use this to grow? And I think that's really, like I said, a fine distinction, but you've been helpful for me.
And I really do believe that, because when I look back over my life, I realize that the hardest times, if I say, God, where are you in this for me? What can I learn? How can I grow from it? Instead of resisting it, it's been an amazing opportunity for growth. And so I think it's about not rejecting God in those moments, because God's not causing it, but God's with me, allowing me to grow from it. Because if you do look at Scripture, that's kind of the story, is that people went through suffering, but the people who were able to look at God as with them and providing, new opportunities, those are the stories we hear.
And I'm not trying to take us down a rabbit hole, I promise, so you can kick me back off to the other side. But I just was thinking about that, a cliche, maybe too strong a word, but the saying that often many of us use that says, God doesn't give me more than I can handle. And to me, that is part of the theology that shines through in moments like this. And which, when I'm given the right moment as a pastor, I always try to say to people, the only image of God that leaves with you is to say, I wish God didn't trust me so much. Because again, I think that it's that piling up, as if God says, well, that didn't break Deb, or Sharon's still going. It's almost the Job-like, test, like, well, that didn't break their faith or break them down, so I'll just keep giving them more. Again, as if God sits on a big puffy cloud in the sky, looks down and says, how much can I give Dawson today? And so to me, this is a moment that we can bring up that cliche or that kind of theology and say, I will say, I don't think that's healthy, life-giving theology that's helpful.
Well, it's very guilt-inducing if
Right.
I fall apart.
And it's about God doesn't give me.
Right.
For me, I think a better way for me to understand it is God is with me in whatever it is I have to deal with.
Well, and it also, to me, and this might be a little bit of a stretch, but to me it also kind of is connected to this sinners in the hands of an angry God type thing, that God is looking to smite us.
Or test us.
Or test us. Whereas I believe that God is looking to love us, support us, journey with us. It does not mean that life doesn't happen, but
here's where I might just offer this, is that there.
feeling a little bold now that we're so close to retirement, aren't we, Dad?
Yeah, well, but
No,
I do think that we are given opportunities, not necessarily by God, but given opportunities in this world for our character to be refined.
Sure.
And that's what I think he's talking about here. 'Cause
Totally
he's
agree.
talking about being purified by suffering.
Yes, totally agree. I just think that as Sharon said, that fine line
Yeah.
is the difference of understanding life brings this versus God sent this.
God pushes it on
Pushes
me to
it,
see
or-
how strong I am.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't.
Yeah. Well, it's like the classic, like pray the hurricane away type thing, which we're all we can be a little guilty of when you live in Florida or even Texas, But part of what we try to remind people of is if that's your fervent prayer, where are you sending that hurricane?
Exactly.
Where else are you sending that hurricane?
Exactly.
And so,
So, and he did talk about the fact that we are purified through suffering.
yeah.
And can you think of a time maybe that you have experienced that or seen it in ministry or in your families, friends? Being purified by suffering. Either one.
Well, I thought of two things in response to that question, and in a personal context, one of the things that I think suffering does is to produce empathy, and to help us be more present and more able to be present with people who are suffering, because we have some sense of what that feels like. And I consider myself in this generation, and maybe that's not correct, but I put myself in this generation that was sort of between, you stay home all the time with your kids or you work all the time. And so parenting and working and finding that balance was always a challenge for me. And there were certainly times of suffering when I wanted to be doing more of one than I was and the other. And the empathy that sort of produced for me was a really clear statement that I made to myself and occasionally said to other people is, I am not going to judge other women for the decisions they make, because I've suffered with working this out over, a period of years enough myself to know whatever you're doing, you may be suffering as you work that out, and whatever choices you may be as ambivalent. So that's an example when, for me, that was just a hard part of life that produced empathy and for others. In a less personal but church context, I think about people, and one person comes to mind in particular, but there are many people like her, Rachel Held Evans, people who've suffered in the church, who grew up with very strict or sort of hellfire and damnation, or just righteous attitudes about gays are wrong, or this abortion is wrong, or whatever it was. And people who grew up in that context and had life experiences that brought about suffering and made them think the church doesn't work anymore for me, and yet it has been transforming, and they have found new life in Christ out of that, and people like Rachel Held Evans have given that gift of life to so many other people. And so that two very different kinds of examples, but that's what came to my mind.
Yeah, I just love the example of Rachel Held Evans. I mean, such a modern saint of the church that we'd lost so too young. I mean, I think she was 41. She was right around my age. But I thought about, as many in this congregation know, and the two of you certainly know, is the experience of when my father and mother, really, in many ways, had a ministry ending experience at a church after I came out publicly, and the deep pain that brought my family, and still to this day can bring up some deep emotions. And yet the freedom the freedom of authenticity that gave our family, because I had already achieved that gift of authenticity, but it also gave our family that gift. There was no more thinking who knows what and who knows who, and those kinds of things. But it also gave my dad the opportunity to re-examine, and he's written and spoken very openly about this, to re-examine his theological structure and his understanding of people and where they are and where they and developed a level of empathy, and it sort of opened a whole new level of ministry in the very end or toward the latter part of his professional ministry and career. But it just had ripples through my family and through parts of our just impact of family, friends, and things like that. And yet it still does to this day. It can still come up. And so, again, in the moment, deeply painful, deeply dark, going through it. And then you see how God was at work. Again, I'm not sure we saw it in those moments, but we saw how God was looking back, we see how God was at work, and we saw the resurrection moments.
Mine's a completely different story, but I still remember visiting somebody who I would describe as one of the saints of this church, who's gone now. But I remember visiting her, and she really suffered the last years of her life and, had all kinds of physical difficulties. And I said, "How are you doing with this?" Because she had a really deep faith. And she said, "Well, the less I can do, the more time I have for God." And so she used her time to write letters to people on a constant basis to encourage them. She said, "I can't do very much, but that's what I can do." And that's how she used her suffering and transformed it into something positive. I'll never forget that woman. I just was like, oh my gosh, the smaller her world became, actually the more influence she had through her suffering. So, okay, so we're going to move on because, of course, we always run out of time. So we're going to go to chapter 40, Righteousness Has a Heart. So we're finally at the section title and now the chapter title. But this was an interesting one, and I think it might cause some interesting conversation. Focuses on the place that worry and doubt have on our lives. Kang recognized that all of us have doubts at different times, but when we focus on those doubts, we become double-minded. He said that when we doubt and worry, our hearts become divided. According to Kang, when we become anxious, we can't fulfill the law of God, the will of God. I had a really hard time with that. I don't know anybody who has not doubted or worried. What did you make of his thoughts on that?
I don't trust people who don't doubt. I mean, I really don't.
I know.
I mean, it's where faith is. I mean, you can't have faith if you don't have doubt, because faith is the counter to doubt. In a very simplistic form, a simplistic way of understanding it. And so, yeah, I mean, again, I know it shocks you that I had counter thoughts to the author, but it's kind of like I don't trust someone who hasn't changed their mind in 20 years on an issue, or at least re-examined it. Like that just doesn't feel natural to me.
It also is bringing out that perfectionism that you can't have these things and be in the will of God, and that just seems kind of simplistic to me.
Well, it's interesting because I think, and we talk about suffering, I think doubt can also be a great catalyst for growth.
Yeah.
Because if you're asking hard questions and you're exploring, whether it's through biblical study or through spiritual disciplines or through study with other people, trying to think about those hard questions, that can lead to a lot of growth. So it's not just that it's real and inevitable, it can be an opportunity for growth. And then I can also be very pragmatic and say that if we want to say to people, well, if you have any doubts, then you're not a good Christian, we're not going to get any new people to join us, and we may lose some of the ones we have, because it's just there. It's just real. And I think about, I taught at a college, and it was a relatively conservative evangelical college, but it was also a very open place in many ways. And a dear friend of mine was the professor of philosophy who taught the introductory philosophy course and was always trying to get students to open their minds, to think through things. And some of them came with such rigid ideas that it was so helpful to think, I don't have to be rigid to be Christian, and I can work through doubt. And we even, one campus-wide study one semester was a book about the certainty of doubt or something like that. It's just so inevitable that I think we really turn people off if we act like there's anything bad about it.
I think what I took from the chapter, because I agree with both of you, it seems inauthentic to me. But what I did take away from it is that the double-mindedness, when I ruminate on doubt and worry, I have a hard time being connected to God. It's not having it, it's getting stuck in it that's my problem. And I will say, I need to wrestle long enough to get to a place, but if I don't ever if I don't ever have the possibility of resolution, that's when I get stuck.
Well, I do think there's a difference, which I found interesting in his writing, that I think there's a difference between doubt and worry. I do believe that we are called to rise above the worry that is such a part of the human experience. I do think that at a certain point that becomes unfaithful. It doesn't mean you are an unfaithful person, but I believe that the action of being consumed by fear and by worry is an unfaithful action. It doesn't mean that we don't all go through those intense periods, but I'm just saying, but I think the idea of doubting also, again, limits what God can do. And again, it's kind of that I don't trust people who try to put God in this very small box and say, God can't react to what you're doing. So, yeah.
Well, let's move on to chapter 41. And he talks here about influencing others through righteousness. He describes the influence we can have on other people. We don't so much revere saints for their great achievements as for their spiritual attitudes. What stands out in their lives is their motives for living to love God and other people. And then he went on to describe Jesus' influence on the world. Jesus didn't become a recognized author or celebrity. He didn't found a mission organization or build great skyscrapers. He wasn't a world traveler, but his influence transcends his generation, ethnicity, and country of origin. The influence of Jesus is timeless and eternal. Grounded in holiness, Jesus overturns the common view that wealth, political power, sexual dominance, and high learning have the greatest impact. So, in describing the impact of saints around us, Kang simply said, people just sense the presence of God in him. So, have you ever met somebody who exemplified that kind of life, and what impact did it have on you?
Mr. Robert, who was a member and a really close friend of my dad's, a member of our church in Santa Fe, Texas. So that was like preschool through kindergarten. And his wife died, his spouse died while we were there, which was heartbreaking for my mom and dad, and obviously for Robert. And I just remember as a small child it being heartbreaking too, because it was kind of like losing a grandparent. But he was just this down-to-earth, loving, gregarious, give you the shirt off his back, mow your yard, do whatever he could do to help a friend, a person in need. And so he was a part of our lives for well beyond our time there, until the time of his death. And we still tell Mr. Robert stories to this day. But he exemplified what I believe God must be like in many ways.
Yeah, I found myself making a list, and in many ways they're very ordinary people. They did, not do all those missions and foundations and
Yeah.
all those kinds of things. But they touched me at different times in my life. I think of two people in particular, both who have passed now, but they were very close family friends, very, very close friends of my parents. And so in some ways they were like second parents, but they were also a different kind of role model, because she was a Christian educator and like a certified lay preacher, who was just dynamic and a worker for peace. And he was, by employment, a director of YMCA's, but they were gentle and good-humored. And what I remember is that even as a child, feeling their sense of respect for me as a person. And they just touched me. And my parents would say, and I think I can say for myself, they always said that they were blessed, have been blessed in their lives to have friends of multi-generations who were older than they were, younger than they were, their age and all. And these were friends who were a good number of years older. But I feel that same thing, that I just am grateful for the people who are older than I am, who are such great role models and mentors, and for friends who were younger and keep me a little bit younger. And
Yeah. And I'd share mine, but we got to move on.
oh dear.
So we're going to go to chapter 42.
All right.
Because I think this is kind of meaty theological stuff, and it really was challenging. He begins the chapter 42 by saying, "Righteousness has power, yes, but evil isn't without its own power and influence. Sin can destroy whatever it touches." He describes sin as a living organism that can ruin individuals, families, communities, and nations. And quite frankly, it rang true for me. Evil can destroy everything that is good. As much as we dislike talking about sin in our circles, we have seen the destruction that it can leave in its wake. I think about cruelty, bullying, addiction, betrayal, and I could go on and on. I know you could too. So how do you see evil in our world, and how do you see sin or evil destroying whatever it touches or not?
The first thing I have to say is I do not equate sin and evil. I think they can be related, but they're not the same thing. I think, and I'm more interested in sin with a capital S that is about our separation from God than I am the little sins. But evil, for me, when I think about it, right now, the examples that I see, the polarization and the demonization of people, of others, and the inability to see the humanity of other people, or to be willing to work together because we're different, so we have to take opposite sides. And I just see that as, yes, destroying whatever it touches. And then the other evil thing that I see happening all around us is this this increasing gap between the rich and the very poor in this country, but around the world. And I think that you could look at those as different kinds of divisions, but that kind of alienation of people from one another, I think, is evil, and it's killing us.
I really struggle with a theology of evil, and I always have, and eventually I'm going to really have to wrestle it to the ground and find some good resources and really do some thinking. But, let's be honest, with everything we have going on, it's not like you want to set time aside to dig in about evil. But in part because of this idea of, is evil how we understand Satan and, with a tail and ears and, coming after us and seeking us. And yet, I don't deny that there is evil at work in the world in all the ways that you described, Sharon, and in ways that I've seen through, especially my work with young people in the school system, bullying. But I've watched adults bully because I know that that's why young people bully, because they watch it modeled for them. And I watch the power of addiction. I was just on a phone call yesterday about a family that's dealing with a very powerful addiction issue, and trying to just listen and help them think through it a little bit. But I don't disagree with the author, but it does challenge me because I feel at times ill-equipped to really think through how to know what I really believe about it, because it is so complex and challenging about how do we look at sin and evil, how are they incorporated, if you will, and how do we deal with them corporately and individually.
And I think it's the struggle for me is the dualism of it. There's good and there's evil. And I think it's a little bit more complex than that. But I think the longer I live, the more I do believe that there is true evil in this world as there is true goodness, without it necessarily creating dualism. But I think that's a conversation that might need more time than we have
Maybe
today.
we should find a good book that might guide us through that
Alrighty then.
sometime.
In 2022.
Exactly, when I'm on sabbatical.
So what he goes on to say, he says, righteousness can restore them all. That he said that righteous living is all about imitating Jesus' way of being and living. He wrote, when we stand before God, we'll find that our titles and churches aren't so important. The only thing God looks for is how much we have become like Jesus. And I really thought that was, as he spent all this time talking about sin and evil,
Yeah.
to then remind us, okay, that doesn't have the final word, that Jesus' example, there are other ways to live. Any comments on that?
To me, I mean, not to play a pun here, but he really does redeem himself through Jesus in this moment for me, because he
Yes.
does remind us that in the end, especially in this time of Lent, we are reminded that it is Jesus who has the ultimate say.
I was teaching a class yesterday, and it was the grace of Les Mis, but that's the unimportant piece of it. But he made this very interesting theological comment. He said that too often the church focuses on Genesis 3, which is the fall, the eating the apple and the fall into sin, and ends at Revelation 20, which is judgment. And he said what we have to remember is that the gospel story starts at Genesis 1 with the goodness of creation and ends at the heavenly banquet. That goodness are the bookends of the story. And I think Kang finally gets there with this chapter. And I really thought that was it was good. So we're running out of time. We have one more chapter to do, and I do want to look at that. It's 43. It's discipline and righteousness is lifelong. He said the deadliest disease of contemporary life is impatience. Oh, probably true. He then goes on to quote Richard Foster, who said that hurry is not of the devil, it is the devil. Where do you see impatience playing out in your life and in the life of those around you?
I think
that's easy.
Living in a pandemic has required such patience.
Yes.
And it made me think that there are many dimensions of the pandemic, and there's anxiety about getting sick and all those other things. But fundamentally, one of the things is the uncertainty. And uncertainty makes us impatient because we want to know. I mean, we've all had been in conversation with someone who's waiting for a diagnosis. And the reality of the diagnosis is slightly easier to deal with than the uncertainty of not knowing. And I think that requires more patience. And certainly in the pandemic, I mean, it is still uncertain. When will life, or what will life be like in the future? When will it seem the new or preferred normal, because it's not going back to the old normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking about was what you just talked about, Sharon, is Deb, you brought this to the proverbial table of what does a preferred normal look like post-pandemic? And as we are making our way out of the pandemic, I'm really thinking a lot about that right now, because when we talked about that really almost a year ago, it was really difficult for me to think about what does a preferred normal post-pandemic look like, because I frankly couldn't envision it, because I thought, well, are we talking a couple of weeks? Are we talking, I never envisioned a year, but a couple months, but Deb, you brought an article and taught us that people were talking about a new normal, and you talked about a preferred normal. What are the patterns, habits, behaviors moving out of the pandemic that we want to take with us, and what are the habits we want to leave behind? And so this idea of hurry and worry and things like that, I'd like to have less of that in my preferred normal.
And I know that the next section is all about the practices that can get us into that place. So I'm actually looking forward to next session. But I'm going to finish with this last part that I thought was pretty, at least it was entertaining. It was the first time I laughed in the book. And Kang challenges us to the long game, that the process of spiritual transformation takes a lifetime. However, we live in a culture that focuses so much on quick success that we have a hard time recognizing that God works in and through all of us, transforming us one day at a time. So then he describes this as a preparation time for all of us. He uses the analogy of plants flourishing in the natural world. He said, some mushrooms spring up in only 6 hours. Squash takes 6 months. An ordinary oak tree takes 6 years, but a full spreading oak tree takes 100 years. So I started wondering, do I have a mushroom, squash, or oak tree view of spirituality? Well, what do you think?
I think it depends on the day, honestly.
Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I think, okay, I can really focus and settle in on an oak tree type spirituality, and then some days I'm like, give me a mushroom.
I just want a little bit of growth to be seen.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think that's my issue, is like I like the mushroom concept, because it's like, okay, God, can you just give me like some more patience than I've had before? I don't want a lifetime for that. I'd really like that now.
Right.
How about you, Sharon?
Well, it's funny because I thought of it maybe a little bit differently, but just there is some comfort for me in the oak tree perspective that it's okay to grow slowly.
Yeah.
Because I feel like some days I'm growing slowly, and that's okay.
And I actually think that is comforting to me too, is that it's a lifetime journey. And if there's anything I've learned from this book, even though he challenges us in certain ways, there is the reminder that this is a lifetime journey. And so I think that we can kind of settle into that.
And when you grow slowly, most often you grow deeply. You have the deep root system that's sustaining.
That needs some water and fertilizer and time and all those good things that we're going to talk about next week. So thank you for being here tonight. There's a scripture that I normally use in memorial services when reflecting on the life and legacy of people of faith. And as a blessing for each one of us tonight, let me share these words from Paul's words to the church at Philippi. He said, I thank my God every time I remember you, constantly praying with joy in every one of my prayers for all of you, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. I am confident of this, that the one who began a good work in you and among you will bring it to completion by the day of Jesus Christ. God is in the transformation business if we can simply open ourselves to it. Good night. Thank you.